So pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I came all the way from Los Angeles, so it was quite a trip for me, but I'm delighted to be back in Israel, where some of my roots have come from. So I'm here to talk about compliance without compromise. It's not the sexiest topic out there, but I can assure you that there are going to be some eye-opening things that we learned today in this presentation. So let me set the stage here before we get into the discussion. The current regulatory landscape looks as follows. We have laws in the US, laws such as the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. How many of the people in this room know what COPPA is? Okay, great. We have laws that regulate student data. So if you're an educational institution or if you are a service provider in the edtech space, there are laws that regulate what types of data you can collect from students and what types of data you can pass on to a tech provider, a service provider in that industry. We all know that there are data breach laws. These are laws that require you to notify consumers if their data has been breached or hacked into. In Europe, we have data transfer restrictions, such as the EU-US Safe Harbor restriction, which doesn't allow you to pass data from European residents into the US. So if you are collecting European data and you're headquartered in the US, that's a no-no unless you're following certain legal requirements. There are cookie laws. I'm sure many of you have started to see those sort of pop-ups that appear on the bottom of websites or drop-downs that appear at the top asking you to agree to a cookie, thanks to the European laws around cookie. We have data retention laws, we have deletion laws, and we have app guidelines. We have the App Store guidelines. We have Google Play guidelines. So that's the regulatory landscape affecting the kids and family market. As one example, and this is the COPPA example, we have a basic equation for how we define whether COPPA is going to apply and the restrictions of COPPA apply to you. If you have personal information, and I won't go into too much detail about that, you collect it from a child under 13 years of age, on a child-directed online service, and that includes everything from a website, an app, a tablet, a game device. If you have all three of those key ingredients, you have an obligation by law in the US, or for any US consumers, to gain verifiable parental consent. And that's a complicated thing to do, as we'll see. What are some of the data types regulated by COPPA? This is a loaded slide, and there's a reason for it. This is a sampling, a pretty good sampling, of all of the different types of data that you might be collecting from kids or families inside of your apps that are regulated by this law, by the COPPA law. Identifiable contact information, things like name, home and mailing address, and the other fields that you see here. Photos and videos. So if you have a photo of a child's face, that's considered personal data, even if you don't know who that kid is any other way. If you have audio recordings, so if a child records their voice inside one of your apps, that gets uploaded to a web server. That's a collection of personal information, which would require, under COPPA, a parent's prior permission. User-generated message, another good example. Chat messages, email messages, personalized drawings, etc. All of that is arguably regulated. Now, if you thought, okay, well, I've avoided all of those categories thus far, so I'm good, well, take a look at the next one, internal usage data. So if you're capturing any sort of usage data, such as gameplay data, learning progress, viewing activities, that also is arguably covered by the regulation. And then finally, geolocation. So there's quite a wealth of data that could be captured by the regulations, and in particular, the COPPA regulation. What are some of the features regulated by COPPA? So you've got registration features. If there's any sort of sign up within your app or within your website, and it's geared toward kids, you have COPPA obligations. Third-party plugins, if you offer any of those, whether it's through a login on a Facebook login or some kind of share widget, those also are directly regulated by COPPA. And not only that, there is a strict liability standard. So you are strictly found liable if you plug in a third-party share feature and it doesn't comply with COPPA. We talked about user-generated content features like chat, messaging, etc. Push notifications, yet another what would seem to be a harmless activity that is regulated by COPPA. And then finally, third-party ad networks, and as I mentioned earlier, third-party analytics. So it's a very heavy regulation when we look at the kids market. So why should you care? So I direct your attention to the second bullet on this slide. The consequences for noncompliance can be quite steep. On average, the Federal Trade Commission fine for a COPPA violation over the past 15 years has been a whopping $416,000 plus on average. Now, there haven't been that many enforcement cases over the past 15 years, around 20 plus, but if you do get hit, it's going to be a big one, potentially. And in addition to the fine, there are costly lawsuits that you have to deal with. You have to hire attorneys to help defend a violation potentially. There's negative PR and brand tarnishment. Typically, a COPPA violation or even any privacy violation will end up on the front page of newspapers. We have also seen that if you mishandle a privacy issue, it can topple your company altogether. How many people in this room know about InBloom? Okay, very few. So InBloom was an attempt by a new tech company with some significant funding behind it from the likes of Microsoft. I believe they had a $100 million investment. They were essentially trying to build a new database of student data for the purpose of progressing education in the United States. And unfortunately, there was perceptions out there as to how much data they were collecting, what it was going to be used for, and the company ended up closing up shop despite the $100 million investment. So we've seen that mishandling of privacy concerns can also lead to the downfall of a company. Lost business opportunity and revenue. Just the other day, a client of mine, a member in the kidSAFE program, called me up urgently and said, Shai, we have a problem. We'd like to advertise our website on a leading television network in the United States, and they won't allow us to advertise our website because they don't feel it's COPPA compliant. And so, in that example, we've seen a case where sort of business partnerships can be impacted if you're not found to be compliant. And then finally, you can lose a lot of consumer data. So you can go through the motions, collect a lot of valuable data, but then only to discover that because you did it improperly, you need to get rid of it. So those are some of the consequences of noncompliance. And the reason why it's so challenging to comply, if you look at two surveys, I'm not sure how legible these are up there, but if you look at two surveys, we conducted a survey before July of 2013, which is when the new version of the COPPA law went into effect. And we asked companies, is it challenging to comply with COPPA in its current form? Over 60% said yes. And that was before the new rules went into place, which are much more strict. The other question we asked is, how much do you think it costs if you're required under COPPA to process a parent's permission before you collect data? How much does it cost on a per-child basis to process parental consent? Okay, and you can see from the numbers here that the cost is quite significant. Most said over $1, or they weren't sure. So with that background, I know that it didn't paint a very rosy picture to start. How do you navigate the legislation? How do you comply? How do you gain a user following despite the legislation? So my goal here right now is going to give you 5 strategies on how you can comply without compromising your business model. Start number 1. The first strategy is to anonymize and localize data collection whenever possible. Okay? You want to de-identify or collect anonymous data. So what are some examples of that? If you're collecting a name, you want to collect just the child's first name. First name is not considered personal data. You want to look for screen name, which is a form of an identifier, but it's not personal under COPPA in most cases. If you're collecting usage and play data, you want to keep it anonymous. Don't link it back, if you can avoid it, to an email address, for example, because then it makes all of the data personal data. If you're going to collect geolocation, just collect non-precise geolocation. Most analytic platforms today allow you to do this. You can limit the preciseness of geo information, so it's only country or region or even city and state, but not more detailed than that. If you offer any sort of messaging functionality, build in automated filtering tools or use a third party to do that for you so that no personal information can be shared. There are tools that enable you to do that. And then for some features, you have the option also to collect information on a temporary basis and then get rid of it. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. The second part of this is to keep data local. And by localization here, I don't mean localizing in particular regions of the world. I mean keep the data on the device. Don't upload it. So if you're offering an app and you have the option, for example, with media files, whether it's photos, videos, and audio, that a child might be putting into an app and then decorating, if there's a way to keep that local on the device and not upload it to your servers, then again, you've escaped most of the burdensome regulations. If you do upload it, however, then you're going to be covered by the regulations. When it comes to notifications, alerts that you want to send to parents or children, you should try to use local notifications instead of push remote notifications, and I'll explain the distinction in just a moment. So let's take a look at one example of anonymizing, where in fact in this case, this is a great example of a one-time collection of data and then immediate deletion. Okay? In the YouTube Kids app, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in this room, there is a search functionality. So you can search content, you can search for videos, and that search functionality allows you to do it with audio. Anyone here know how that audio function is working? Anyone want to take a guess? No? So essentially what's happening is Google is recording the child's voice. It's uploading it to its server. It's transforming it or transliterating it, whatever the proper terminology is, into text. So if you follow the arrows there, it goes from the search to the audio to the text. And as soon as the audio is converted into text, it immediately deletes the child's audio recording. So it's uploading it temporarily on a one-time basis, and it's immediately purging it and getting rid of the data. Now, this doesn't work in all cases and with all kinds of data, and it's possible that this was considered a new exception under the COPPA regulations. But what's interesting about this scenario is, well, what happens if you search for a physical address? Now what? So yeah, they dumped the child's audio recording, but apparently they've kept, or potentially have kept, the address that I've searched for. I'm not sure what happens then. By contrast, this is an example from a company called Toy Talk. They offer an app called Speak a Legend, and this is where you can converse and have conversations with all kinds of weird-looking people or creatures. And in this example, so unlike the YouTube example, they've got a record button. They take the child's recording, they upload it to a server, they convert it into text, they make sense out of it, and this creature responds in a personalized way based on what the child has said. Now, again, by contrast to the YouTube example, they are storing the child's recording, and not only are they storing it, they're making it available for the parent to play back and listen to those audio recordings. So the parent can see what kind of conversations their kids are having with Bigfoot in this example, right? So this is a scenario where they would need to gain a parent's prior permission before they can allow for this feature. In another example here with the Osmo Masterpiece drawing feature, this is a picture of a kid, happens to be my son, and they've taken a picture here, which by itself is considered personal. They convert it into a sketch. That's the purpose of this app. So they've just anonymized personal data, right? I can draw a picture of my son, and then I can share it with dad, or my son can draw a picture of himself and then share it with dad, and then it plays back my son's drawing while he's drawing that picture. so that the parent can view it. So that's another example of anonymization. And then finally, local versus push. So local notifications are notifications. They're similar to push notifications, except that they're pre-scheduled. They're coded into the app itself, so they don't run over the iOS cloud. And as a result, they're not touching the web. And again, it's a local mechanism for delivering notifications without having to deal with the COPPA regulations in that case. I saw a 5-minute warning sign, so I'm going to have to fly through the rest of this. How much is that a strict 5 minutes? Okay. I guess we want to leave some time for questions. So number two, the second strategy. So the first one is to anonymize and localize data collection. The second one is get parents involved. Now, what does that mean? So you want to have a parent or grown-up section within your site. How many of you have apps for kids in this room? How many of you have a parent corner within the app? Okay. So it's become a popular technique. It's really not appropriate in all cases. It's mainly for kids, for apps that are geared toward young kids who can't navigate to the parental section on their own. But that's something you might want to look at and put features that are intended for the grown-up. You have to know when to use a age gate versus a parental screen versus an age screen. You also want to get parental consent when it's needed. Some features will require that. And then finally, know which guidelines apply to your particular app, because Apple and Google guidelines are not always the same as COPPA guidelines. Okay. Here are some illustrations of parental gates. On the right-hand side, you see some of the more common mechanism of multiplication, a math equation, or you see number entries in the middle, or a special swipe at the bottom. On the left, you see a confusing selection. I couldn't even figure this out on my own. But there are different ways you can approach this depending on the sophistication of the child and the age of the child. This is an example of an age screen, by contrast. This is where you ask a parent for their year of birth, their date of birth, their age. This is what you should be using if you offer any data collecting features in the parent section. So if there's a newsletter sign up, if there's any data collection, if there's a share function, this is what you want to be using instead of the parental gate. Apple and Google guidelines are different when it comes to this. If you look at the Apple guidelines, you'll see they say you need to have a parental gate for in-app purchases. Google will say you don't need to have a parental gate for in-app purchases. I'm going to skip over this one. Number 3, get a handle on third parties. Okay, this is perhaps the most important strategy. You need to know which third-party plugins you can use, which ones are problematic, which ones are not. You need to know which third-party SDKs you can use, whether it's for analytics or ad networks. And you need to know which third-party vendors you're using and what data they're collecting. This is the most important part of COPPA compliance by a long shot. Did you not want me to skip over Neopets?
I've been playing it for like 10 years.
Okay, good. So I won't skip over the Neopets example. Well, Neopets has got a conglomeration of all kinds of social functions. And it turns out, and I'm glad she brought that up, most would look at Neopets and say, this is directed to children. Well, the average Neopets user is a lot older than you think. I think it's like around 36, somewhere in that neighborhood. So that's why they've got all these features here. But it's a good example of what's allowed and what's not allowed. The login with Facebook feature would be a problem under COPPA. The follow us feature on the bottom would be acceptable because that's linking over to Facebook. The sign up with Facebook would also be a problem, at least on a child-directed website. Look at the different SDKs and ad networks and platforms out there. They all, not all, but many of them have child-directed settings that you can look at and use so that your app or site would be compliant with COPPA, even if you had them embedded. Number 4 is an easy one. Implement a privacy policy. I know this sounds simple, but many companies still don't have privacy policies. Many app developers still don't have privacy policies. If they do, they copy it from somewhere else. If they do, they're still not posting a link to it on the homepage of their site, of their app, like you see here in these 2 examples. This is an easy one. And this is the first thing that the FTC will look at if they're trying to find violators. They'll go to your app. They'll check if you have a privacy policy link. And then finally, get audited and certified. I know this is somewhat self-serving, but it doesn't have to be kidSAFE. It can be anyone. You need to get audited and certified if you can afford it for compliance, because what that does for you is it's going to protect you. It's an insurance policy, a quasi-insurance policy. It will help protect you from being sued by the Federal Trade Commission and being subject to potentially large fines. So to recap, anonymize and localize data collection, get parents involved, get a handle on third parties, implement the privacy policy, and then finally get audited and certified. If you do these 5 things at a minimum, you're going to be in very good shape. Not only with COPPA, but with virtually any regulation that pertains to privacy and safety. No, I'll take questions. I'll open up for questions.
First off, I'd like to thank Shai for this wonderful yet scary talk. Maybe you could shed some light on Apple's age rating system when you, as a developer, has to, enter like the 4+, 12+, decide a few things. You also have the questionnaire by Google Play, which is quite new. If you can talk about that, thanks.
Well, from a compliance standpoint, those are important because those could suggest that you're self-tagging yourself, you're self-labeling yourself as a child-directed app. Now, for years, if you looked at the Facebook rating on the App Store, I'm not sure if it's changed recently, but for many years it was 4+. That was the age rating for Facebook, 4+. So, and clearly that's not accurate. But I think from a compliance standpoint, it's important to know that if you place yourself, for example, in the kids category in the App Store, or on the family category in Google Play, you're basically saying to the outsiders and the regulators, you are a child-directed app, potentially, and therefore subject to the regulations. So there's some creativity that you can explore there. For example, a lot of our members, if there's an educational component to their app, will choose to categorize themselves in the education category. And therefore, evade, if you will, some of the strict COPPA requirements. For example, they won't have to put in a parental gate when they link outside of their app, or they have an in-app purchase. So those are some of the tricks and techniques. And I'm not suggesting you do that if it's not truthful, but definitely if you have the option to be in another category, and assuming it's not exclusively for kids, then that should definitely be something you look at to make sure you properly label yourself. Yeah.
I just want to say, with the age gate thing, even Apple is interested in it. Like, we have an age gate in an app that's, been downloaded millions of times, and we did an update, and they said, you have to change it.
Right.
For no reason. I mean, it was, it just seemed like the whim of a reviewer.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, we've through our members, we've gotten all kinds of different feedback. Another good example, where Apple was saying one thing for one app developer and something different for the similarly situated app developer was, can you have registration as the very first thing when you land in an app? So can you collect a parent's email? So many of the reviewers will say, well, no, Apple doesn't allow for that because they want there to be some experience the child can engage with even prior to there being registration. Yet others allowed it. So yeah, there is a lot of inconsistency when it comes to that. And one of the things we do on top of auditing and certifying companies is we help them, navigate those issues with Apple and explain.
Well, and with certification, I can recommend that as well. Like we're working on a feature to share, so that kids can share content that they create. And we had thought that we could have them create something that's shared via email, no personal information. But even though it's going out to the email program and attached, it's, so we wouldn't have thought that if somebody wasn't certifying it. So.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to share features, even if you're not collecting any of the data, so let's say you've got an email feature that you embed within your app. So after a kid creates some kind of artwork and they want to share it, you launch the native email client inside of your app so the kid can share it. That's not allowed under COPPA, even though it's not even your email client and you're not even collecting any of the data. You're not even seeing the email address information. You're just allowing it to pass through. That's an embedded third-party plugin that is collecting data, and you're responsible for it as the first party. A lot of privacy policies will say, well, we're not responsible for any third-party plugins. And that's standard language. By the way, if you have that in your privacy policy and you have an app for kids, that's a big red flag. It's a big warning sign. Because you can't disclaim liability under COPPA for third parties or third-party plugins that you embed inside of your app. You can do it outside the kids market, you can do it all day long. But when it comes to the kids market, you can't do that anymore.